It's that time of the week again, our Worldview Friday, and my conversation with my colleague, David Closson, who's FRC's director of the Center for Biblical Worldview. Over the last 2 years, there's been a lot of chatter about education, much of it inspired by COVID. Who's in charge? Parents or school administrators? Should critical race theory be taught or not? Increasingly, one of the questions that these questions have led to is, should Christians send their kids to public schools at all? It's not a simple question, but it's one worth talking about, and that is the subject of our Worldview conversation today with David Closson. David, welcome back to the show.
Hey, great to be with you, Joseph.
Well, it's great to see you. Now, this is a sensitive subject, and that's what I want to talk about first. You and I have dealt with a lot of controversial issues. We deal with same-sex marriage and gender and all sorts of things that will get people emotional. But I would propose to you that you go into any church in America today, and if you want to get people excited, if you want to get people's emotions and passions arise, this is one of the subjects that you could talk to them about and say, hey, you shouldn't go to public schools, or absolutely you should go to public schools. So before we get into the meat of that, why do you think this is such a difficult conversation for Christians to have?
Well, first of all, Joseph, you're absolutely right. How important this conversation is, the emotions that it evokes. Just look at some of the big elections. Just earlier this week in San Francisco, a very, very progressive city, they had a recall and kicked 3 members of the school board off the school board because parents were so fired up about decisions that were being made. In Virginia last year, one of the reasons Glenn Youngkin won a state that had gone for Joe Biden by 10 points the year prior was largely this school issue. And I think the reason people get so fired up about this issue is because this is about our children. And we're specifically going to talk about Christian parents, but I think all parents, have that natural instinct that I believe comes from the Lord to want to protect and nurture and defend their children. So that's why this is such an important issue for parents, regardless of political party or background or views on a whole host of other issues.
I think that's fair. And I think when you talk about this subject, anytime you say this is what parents should do, there's this implication that means parents should not do something else. And parents get very defensive, understandably so, when you hear somebody making an argument that suggests perhaps they would do the wrong thing with their kid, or even worse, they already have done the wrong thing with their kids. And I think that's one of the reasons why this is a difficult conversation. And it's one of the reasons we need to enter it with a lot of grace. Yeah. Because, I say as the parent of 4 child on behalf of all parents, none of us is perfect, and none of us has done this, perfectly. But I do want to ask this, if a parent came to you and asked you the question, should I send my child to a public school? What are the things that you're going to think about? What are the things that you're going to encourage them to think about?
Yeah, I think the first place that I would start with any parent, because this, after all, is our Biblical Worldview segment, is I want to start with the Bible. And we know, Joseph, the statistic that you and I have talked about multiple times on this show is, 81% of those who attend church think they have a biblical worldview, when in reality it's only about 21%. So I would start with a verse that I'd like to read. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, I think is a key text for how parents should see their responsibility to their children. This is one of the most well-known passages in the Old Testament. In verse 4, it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And these words I command you today shall be on your heart." And then here in verse 7, "You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise." And then it goes on from there. So I think the place to start the conversation is to remind, especially Christian parents, that you are the chief disciple maker in your home. Your responsibility, first and foremost, is to care for your children, to nourish them. Having children is a special stewardship from the Lord. So I think that's the first step. We just need to remind Christian parents of what God's Word says about their responsibility as parents. And then from there, I would look at the pros and cons of public school, private school, homeschool, and whatever the options that would be facing each parent.
So do you think it's possible that if we frame the question as, should you send your kid to a public school or not, are we asking the wrong question? Should we be more fundamentally considering what is the best way to disciple my child? What's the best environment for them to be formed spiritually in the way that Jesus wants them to be?
I think so, Joseph, because again, education, what is education? It's really a form of discipleship. You're imparting information, but you're more than just imparting head knowledge. Part of the education system is you are teaching people to love certain things. There's a morality, there's an ethics that is intertwined with education. Right before we came on the show, I just Googled pros and cons of public school just to see what showed up. And most of the things that were there was, one of the pros is that it's free and that teachers have to have credentials and that there's opportunities for extracurriculars. And I think all of those things are important things to think about. What does your family value? What's important? But I do think, first and foremost, if I'm a Christian parent, I'm thinking about the education of my child in terms of discipleship and in terms of forming their loves. And so I do think that's probably a helpful way to even just approach the conversation from the beginning.
I think that's wise. And the point that you've made that I'll underline again here in the way we think about this, because I want to make sure we are asking the right questions, in part because it's so emotional, and in part because it's so important. The job of Christians, of course, is to fulfill the Great Commission, and that is to go out into all the world and make disciples. And when you're a parent, the first person or the first people that you have the obligation to make disciples of is your children that God gives you, right? And that's part of what you read there out of Deuteronomy chapter 6. So the question we have to ask is, what is the best way to make disciples of our children? How would you evaluate that question given the options? And you mentioned them. There are government schools, there are public schools, homeschooling is an option that people are increasingly choosing. How would you evaluate the question of what's the best way to make disciples among those options?
Yeah, I think each option does have some things going for it, some things that parents should think about deeply. Homeschooling, I think, is a wonderful option for so many families because you can control the content. You can control exactly what the children are learning, the lessons. You can walk through it. You don't have to worry about bad influences in the classroom. So obviously, I think homeschooling is a wonderful option. It's the option my parents chose for many years, and I'm grateful they did. Private school is another great option. And there's different types of private school, though. There are classical schools, there's private Christian schools, and all private schools are not created equal, Joseph. Let me just read one. There's actually an article that came out just a couple days ago highlighting the National Association of Independent Schools. This is an organization that provides guidance to 1,600 private schools K through 12 in the United States. And what they were doing, it was actually making sure that gender ideology was being put in every classroom. It was kind of an expose, undercover journalism that Breitbart did. But what they found out is that this information that this group was putting into 1,600 private schools was information where they were talking about as young as pre-K about bodies, about the body parts children are born with, if body parts is what makes you a boy or a girl, or whether it's feelings. And so I think we just we need to acknowledge not all private schools are created equal. I think that's important. And then obviously with public schools, we can talk about public schools, the government schools. FRC tracks things that the Biden administration are doing. There's a whole host of things that the Department of Education has done in the last year that, in my view, make public schools something that I would be hesitant to send my kid to a public school, knowing some of the things that the Biden administration is doing. But again, I do think every parent has to look at their own situation and take it to the Lord. Let's not take prayer out of this equation. We need to ask the Lord what you're calling us to do each and every year and be willing to evaluate that every school year.
David, I want to take exception with one thing you said. You suggested there that when you homeschool, there are no bad influences in the classroom. And for those of us who have multiple children, I assure you that is not always the case, that there could be bad influences in the classroom at home as well. Now, my wife got her master's degree in education. And at a public university, the University of Washington, and Seattle, as we all know, is not a hotbed of conservatism or Christian values. And one of the things that she concluded, and she and I are frankly products of public education. We both graduated from a public high school. But she determined after finishing her master's degree, the thing that she concluded was that I'm never going to send my kid to a public school as a result of that. And that was an interesting takeaway for me. Do you think that the public school system has the same goals as parents who are trying to raise their children up in the fear and admonition of the Lord?
Increasingly, no. And I would actually say a resounding no, especially over just the last year. And of course, that didn't just happen with the Biden administration. But Joseph, just a couple of things. Let me just be pointed. One of some of the major goals that you're seeing in public schools around the country under the auspice of the Department of Education is increasing gender ideology, that being put into the classrooms. Critical race theory. Again, that's in the news all the time. People say that it's not being taught. Well, we see example after example where it is being put into the classroom. But just a couple, let me just give you two examples of what's happening in our public schools, because I think a lot of people don't realize this. But after the Biden administration took office, 1 month into office, they directed through to the Department of Education that the Bostock decision, which is a decision that the Supreme Court came out with a couple of years ago, where they redefined the term sex. Now the Department of Education is saying under Title IX, sex is now to be understood as including gender identity and sexual orientation. On August the 2nd, just a couple of months ago, the White House actually released a fact sheet talking about how they're going to reopen schools. There's a lot of issues going on with COVID and mask and social distancing. With all of those health issues going on, they still felt the need to put out guidance, a comprehensive guidance on how Title IX enshrines gender ideology in schools. And one other thing, Joseph, President Biden successfully nominated Catherine Lamont as Assistant Secretary of the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education. She was confirmed 51-50. It took the vice president to block that tie. Now that she's in place, she is now overseeing the way civil rights is handled in the Department of Education. This is someone who, under the Obama administration, put out a Dear Colleague letter that said that boys who identify as girls should be allowed to use restrooms that conform to their gender identity. This is someone who, in that same letter, said that biological boys should be allowed to use the dormitories that girls are housed in on overnight school trips. And in this same letter that she put out, said that teachers should use the preferred pronouns and preferred names of students in their class. Again, this is a person who's leading the Department of Education, appointed by the president. And let me just add, the Secretary of the Department of Education, Miguel Cardona, when asked in his confirmation hearing if biological boys should be allowed to compete against biological girls on sports teams, he could not answer the question. So again, to your question, what are the goals and the aims and the objectives of public education? Increasingly, it is not reading, writing, and arithmetic. It is gender ideology and other goals of the progressive left in this country. Parents do need to know that.
Yeah. And I think operating with an awareness of the landscape that we're actually operating in is important, because those of us who are products of public education, many of us, and I will include myself in this, have very fond memories. I can't think of anything that happened. And now I went to a private Christian school early in my life, ended up graduating from a public high school, did my entire high school career in a public high school. And I honestly, when I reflect back on that, I can't think of a single moment where I was like, oh, that was terrible. That should have never happened. So I actually have pretty good memories of my public school experience. And so a lot of us who are now parents, we remember that and we think, oh, it's really not that bad. And I think one of the important things to realize for parents is how much the landscape has changed. And one other thing I'll say about this is that as you've pointed out, it's not really a public school or private school situation. There are public schools that may be good partners with parents, because there are some towns in America that are mostly, those schools are filled with people that share our worldview. And there are private schools that are just as hostile as, downtown San Francisco or downtown Seattle or downtown Washington, D.C. public schools might be to Christian values. So it's not public-private. It's, are they good partners in discipleship, or are they not good partners in discipleship? And I'll also say, as much attention as something like critical race theory and gender theory has gotten, we as parents shouldn't think about this in terms of, I just want to protect my kid from all the bad stuff while they're in school. I hope that we have a higher standard, and that we really think about these years of education as opportunities to fill our kids with good stuff, to equip them with the tools they're going to need to not only withstand the darkness, but to push back against the darkness and make progress against the kingdom of hell. We need to be building soldiers who are capable of engaging in this battle effectively. And we only do that by asking the right questions and by partnering with the right people. But David, my little sermonette is over, and I'm going to wrap it up there because we're out of time, but really appreciate your time and being with us as always.
Thank you, Joseph.